to this morning's session on victims, compensation, melancholy, shaping the legacies of revolution and violence in France, 1794 to 1834, quite a mouthful. I think your being here at 8:30 on the second morning of the conference is a sign of Republican virtue. Either that or a quest for celebrity, because this session is actually to be podcast, thanks to David Smith and H. France. So we'll all be on our best behaviour. I'm not in fact Colin Jones. If you're still working from the old program, I don't have the right kind of smile to be Colin Jones. My name's David Garriock, and I've stepped in as chair for a revised session, which in fact includes now only 2 papers and an extended commentary. So that will be the structure for this session. Fortunately, we still get Colin Jones. He is here, sitting at the end there. Colin is Professor of History at Queen Mary College, the University of London. He's currently Carla and Leila Pforzheim Fellow at the National Humanities Centre in North Carolina. And if you go to Colin's elegant webpage, you will find beneath his smiling face and an abundant moustache an impressive, he's trimmed it a bit for the occasion, you'll find an impressive list of publications on many aspects of French history. On the social history of medicine, on the French Revolution, of course, and in recent years he's focused heavily on Paris with magnificent general history of the city, with work on the engraver Saint-Aubin, and most recently with a book that's out there on the table, The Smile Revolution in 18th Century Paris from Oxford. Colin's currently working on a new book on the 9th of Thermador, and there was a fine article last year in the American Historical Review, which I'm sure many of you will have seen. Today he's talking to us about Maximilien Robespierre, melancholic victim of his own virtue, ?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for everyone for coming along today. I meant to say to David as well to advertise my latest publication, which you'll find in the most recent French edition of Vanity Fair. Reaching out to a new audience. So my project, as David said, is on 9th of Thermador, and I really want to look at what's happening during that day and to focus on those 24 hours. And my article in the American Historical Review was looking at the crowds, the Parisians. And in the project, I've sort of left towards the end looking at, obviously, the main man, Robespierre, during the day. And that's partly because this delaying of treatment of Robespierre is because I think Robespierre is a sort of black hole. You know, he draws historians towards him and they get lost within him forever, and you just become totally obsessed with him. And I didn't want that to happen. But also, it was also the challenge of saying something new about this figure that's so much has been written about over the years. So my sort of approach on this was been, what was he up to? And can we get a sense of what he might have been up to by looking at what went on in the 24 hours or so that encompassed the coup, the prelude and the coup of the 9th of Thermador. We know, for example, that he got up at a normal time on that day. We know he had breakfast in the Duplay household. We know that he said to Maurice Duplay, his landlord, everything's going to be all right today. We know he walked to the convention as he normally did with some friends. We know then, of course, because it's in the every account, that he was silenced within the convention, and apart from a few curses and expostulations, was allowed to say nothing. We know that he and his fellow conspirators were sent down, in fact, to the office of the Committee of General Security, where they waited and were served actually what looks like a pretty good lunch, in fact, before being taken out separately to the prisons of Paris. We know, of course, that Robespierre was refused admission to the Luxembourg prison and was taken off to the police headquarters which were in the Mairie on the Ile de la Cité. And we also know from a number of testimonies at that time that he was in pretty bad shape physically and emotionally. We know that his fellow conspirators called him to the Hôtel de Ville, to the Maison Commune. We know that he resisted going there, and it was only on the 3rd time of asking that he went there. When he went there, he was very silent and did not make much of an impact on the big crowds, either outside or inside the Maison Commune. And we know that he was sitting in that side room when a gun went off, whoever shot it, and he was wounded sufficiently to have ended the coup. He was then taken out, and the whole story was over. There's the conundrum of that last signature: does it or does not have his blood on it? You know, those sorts of things. But it doesn't add up to very much, quite frankly. And of course, with the jaw industry, jaw injury, I should say, there's no possible means of getting anything out of him the next day, on the 10th of Thermador, before he was executed. All his documents were seized and were published, but they don't really show much sign of that plot which the Thermadorians ascribed to him. So, by the time that those documents were published, however, his reputation was, of course, shattered and completely beyond recall of reputation. A sort of wailing wall of vituperation opened up against Robespierre very, very quickly after the overthrow, and he was seen as representing, impersonating, encapsulating the terror. Three main types of accusation against him. One was a sort of historical reenactment. He was, in fact, either Catalina or Nero or Caesar or Cromwell, or the sort of political science approach. He was a sort of political tyrant or dictator. And again, there was sort of a range of possibilities what type of dictator he could be. Or, and this is very, very frequent, he was a monster. Sometimes he was identified with a vampire, a chameleon, a sphinx, or as hydra, but most frequently it was a tiger. And this reputation, this tigerishness of Robespierre is something which there's no evidence of before the 9th of Thermador, but a great, enormous sort of monument of tigerishness was built up around him, which still finds appears here and there in the record even now. We look at Ruth Sker's very interesting biography of Robespierre. She refers to him as feline. That is actually Thermadorian propaganda speaking. That no one before the end of it made out Robespierre to be a tiger. So there's a huge and very distorting monument of vituperation that we have to get through or around to try and get to that question: what did Robespierre really want on the 8th and 9th of Thermador? And of course we end up going back to that great speech that he made the previous day in the 8th of Thermador, that intensely and even painfully human, existentially revealing document. The last speech he gave, first in the convention and then repeated in the Jacobin Club that evening. And of course, most people say, well, it's most famous really for triggering revolt against him, because he made it clear that he had a list of opponents who would therefore fear for their lives, but he refused under questioning to state who they were. And the idea is that triggered this massive conspiracy against him. So that speech is either a masterpiece of political trickery and bad faith, or, as Robespierre actually appeared to be stating himself in the speech, the last throw of the dice, the last will and testament of Maximilien Robespierre, and even the drinking of hemlock was evoked by him and famously picked up by David in the session in the Jacobin Club. Sympathisers to the Robespierre cause, if we can call them that, have tended to treat that speech in that latter way, really, and as a way of sort of eliciting sympathy, I think, for Robespierre. And most recently, I think it's been very evident in some of the best treatments that have recently been made of Robespierre. I'm thinking obviously of Peter McPhee's recent biography, where his idea is that basically Robespierre was ill, was sick. He had just lost it because of physical illness. But it's also there, I think, in both the books by Marisa Linton and the recent one by Tim Tackett, where basically the idea is he was frightened, that basically the terrorists were terrified, if you like, as a sort of attempt to bring into the emotional history, into the history of the revolution, and had sort of emotionally, burnt out or exploded on that day. So we've got a sort of whole range there, Robespierre from the tigerishly monstrous individual to that sort of poor little Maxi figure that we're supposed to somehow feel sorry for because he's emotionally or mentally under strain. And it's interesting, I was thinking about this earlier, how, the debates on the terror are always divided between, those who believe in the thesis of circumstance and those who don't. In some ways, Robespierre has his own thesis of personal circumstances. Things were so bad against him that he just blew up. Others have seen his actions on the latter part of the of the terror as being very much part of his general character. So my take is different from, I think, both those approaches, really. I'm certainly rejecting, as I'll state very briefly, the emotional sort of illness paradigm. I will be saying, secondly, that Robespierre was still, and thought of himself, I think, still as a serious player with a mission, a political agenda that we can read in that speech. And then thirdly, that in some ways the 8th of Thermadorian speech is less the last dregs of terror, as it's usually and probably quite rightly seen as, but also, or either or, the first sip of Thermadorian reaction. The illness paradigm, I honestly think it's not there. I don't think the evidence is there to support the idea that Robespierre was sick at the end. We know that he does have sickness. We know that he was sick in February and March, but he never attended anything, and people were talked about it, and the sans-culottes visited his house to check on his health. They didn't do that in the month or two before the 9th of Thermidor. It's true also, if you read his sister's memoir, Charlotte Robespierre's memoirs, she says, well, Robespierre at one stage, yes, he was ill, but not as ill as he thought he was. So she obviously diagnosed man flu in Maximilien. But we do know he was absent from the National Convention for roughly 6 weeks before the coup. But on the other hand, he seemed possibly even to have attended some meetings of the Committee of Public Safety. He certainly did some business there because there were signatures, and he was a very frequent presence in the Jacobin Club. That doesn't seem to me add up to a sort of terminal state of sickness or illness. So my sense is that he was still there as a player. He hadn't given up. This isn't consciously a last will and testament, not just a sort of great emotional splurge, which many people talk about that speech as, but when you read it, it's got a pretty clear set of political objectives. And those objectives are, and it's a big program, punish traitors within the convention, whoever they may be, purge the Committee of General Security, bring it directly under the control of the Committee of Public Safety, purge the Committee of General Security's bureaucracy, a lot of emphasis on that, full of knaves and royalists and aristocrats, purge the Committee of Public Safety, and certainly purge the Finance Committee and possibly bring it in-house to the Committee of Public Safety, oppose left-wing manipulation of famine plots as political leverage. He's very tough on the left, in other words, and support the convention, support the Committee of Public Safety, and support the Revolutionary Tribunal as the basis of the way ahead. So it's it seems to me that's a very clear set of objectives. It's not just a great sort of emotional sort of statement. That is a program, that is an agenda. And what also strikes me when you look at it and go through those things, those are many of them tasks which the Thermadorians actually achieved. There's a surprisingly large overlap, in other words, between his program of action on that, as set out on that day, and what became the Thermadorian program. We can talk about that later, and obviously there are things which they disagreed on. But in some ways, you know, there's that overlap, which in other words implies that Robespierre was to some degree writing the script of his successors. So 8th of Thermidor's speech is a bald exposition of what would prove to be, in some respects, the way ahead in terms of policy. But I'm also going on to argue, very much in line with the rest of the session, that there's a strong overlap too in the political mood of his speech and the Thermidorian and directorial periods. One of the key facts of the Thermadorian, facets of the Thermadorian and directorial period, as I think Alex's papers and you know, other work has already been showing, is the development of discourses of victimhood. Indeed, one may ask whether to some extent there is not the emergence of the kind of victim culture. I know there's problems with that term, which we see today. Here I'm less interested in the consideration of who were the victims of the terror and the extent of their guilt, complicity and whatever, you know, those sort of social science approaches. But the point today is rather to note in passing the prevalence of what I call a victim-subject position in many of the writings of the post-9 Thermidor period, and then, and most importantly today, well, this is what I'm going to do, to highlight the extent to which that victim-subject position was prefigured in the speeches and writings of Robespierre, and most especially in that final speech.
what I've done is I've gone through all of Robespierre's work, looking for signs, if you like, for pre-echoes of the mood and the sort of atmosphere and the gestures and the rhetorical moves that he makes, that he made on those days. And basically one finds in that, in his work, a sort of sense of self-absorption and attention-seeking, a very clear Manichaean division of the world into good and bad, a sort of hyper-emphasis on his own virtues and spotless innocence of charges laid against him, and his capacity for manipulation of others and others' feelings, and his ability to use the status as virtuous victim to legitimize action against others. So in other words, I'm saying he's playing the victim card, if you like, and that victim card can be empowering. It gives a sense of, implicit within it, if you like, is a sense of rightful entitlement. It's not to say that other people haven't said that sort of thing before, but what they've tended to do is to see it as a sort of emerging out of a particular character set of Robespierre, as a psychological and emotional reaction, if you like, to the circumstances, the sort of underlying malaise which comes out in this particular way. So my own emphasis is not on the psychological or emotional roots of these characteristics, than on the extent to which Robespierre plays them in a very acute and self-conscious way, actually throughout his life and career. Not an emotional reaction then, but it's about cognitive decision-making. Robespierre's not that monster, certainly, of Thermadorian propaganda, nor I don't think is he the poor little Maxi of Marisa Linton and Peter McPhee and Timothy Tackett's view. Robespierre's still a player. It fits with my approach that he has a set of rhetorical and political strategies which play up to some extent that poor little Maxi approach, but it's done as a sort of very, with consummate skill, as a very sort of conscious move. So 8th of Thermador is not that last emotionally supercharged, deeply, confusedly rambling, expiring, and so farewell, Gloria Swanson-like sort of farewell to the revolution. It wasn't the parts that got small, it was the revolution that got small type of approach. It is rather a repetition of a set of tropes that Robespierre has been using almost from the start of his political career, and in some cases even before that, frankly. So it's useful to look at 8th and 9th of Thermador as a political crisis that he sought to solve using techniques that he'd used before. And that's my approach. What I've really focused on in reading on his work is how he actually deals with, in his speeches but also in his actions, with other crises. And there's a whole set of these. You think of actually the Champ de Mars problem in 1791, outbreak of war, 92, overthrow of the king, facing down the Girondin attack in late 1792, the exclusion of the Girondins, the 22 Prairial debates, actually another real crisis. And I think what you see is a sort of repetition of approach in those periods that perhaps people haven't looked at or taken very seriously. And in terms of the rhetoric that he's using at those times, long and rambling speeches, very self-absorbed. You know, people sometimes say his last speech was completely rambling. I don't think they've read any other speeches by Robespierre. All his speeches are very deliberately rambling. Everyone says, you know, please stop. He just carries on. He uses carrying on endlessly as a political weapon. The evocation of his own death, well, you know, frankly, this is crying wolf. He's been like predicting his own death, or loving the idea of his own death, ever since he started in the revolution. In fact, you see him before the revolution, before he ever went to Versailles, in some of his legal briefs and his political writings in Arras in early 1780. He's talking about death even there. You know, this is not. We should not be taken. I'm sure the revolutionists are not thinking this either. This is Maximilien, you know, this is his approach, always evoking his own death. Attention seeking, I think it's very interesting. Biot Varenne, in some of the sort of final days of Robespierre, is alleged to have said to Robespierre several times, Robespierre, you're just like Pisistratus. Like you, I'm sure. I thought, well, who the hell is he talking about? Well, Pisistratus actually was, it's a story in Herodotus, a tyrant in Greece, who basically became a tyrant by before he was a tyrant, he went out of the city and he covered himself and his mule apparently with wounds, and then he went back into the sort of forum and said, look, my enemies have sort of and he showed his wounds, if you like, and as a result I guess it was the government of the city or whatever gave him the possibility to have an armed force to protect him, a sort of praetorian guard avant la lettre, if you like. And when he had that guard, he took power and he became a tyrant. So in other words, there is a sense of Robespierre, it's not just us saying this, he seems to be self-absorbed. People thought he was self-absorbed. People thought he was using his sort of status as the wounded hero as a political stratum. And that sort of personalisation, I think, is absolutely fundamental. As I say, it's not just the 9th of Thermidor where suddenly the existential stuff comes up into his work. It's there absolutely throughout all his articles. So 8th of Thermidor is a repetition in crisis management. That's my sort of approach, really. And that sort of crisis management at which Robespierre was very adept. In order to understand 8th of Thermidor, we need to study the circumstances in which he spoke, however, as well. I think there's always a tendency in people who look at Robespierre to do a very textual reading of Robespierre, because you've got all those speeches, you just wade through them, What you need to do, I think, as well, what I've tried to do myself, is to look at them in terms of the context of the speeches, whether in the National Assembly or in the Jacobin Club, and then also to see the extent to which he sometimes doesn't actually say anything. Silence is very important for him, considering especially that, endlessly talking is also very important for him. And so when we look at that 8th of Thermidor crisis, we see not just the words that he's using, but also the way in which he's acting, if you like, in the days leading up to the day. Preceding silence before a crisis. As people have said, there's 6 weeks of apparent silence, certainly in the convention, although I'm arguing not at all in the Jacobin Club. This is not used, I think, just to, because he's ill. I don't think he is ill, actually, but any more ill than he ever was anyway, but to stake out his position. And we see that use of silence, of just withdrawing from debate in many other crises. He sort of plays dead. That is the way in which he responds to a crisis. He withdraws, if you like. We see that in the Champ de Mars of 1791. We see that on the 10th of August of 1792. We see that certainly over the Girondin expulsion in May and June as well. Second point, which I think, again, we mustn't see as just, a one-off from the 8th of Thermidor, the studied imposition, I say studied imposition of his accusations against individuals he targeted. And, people always say it showed that he'd lost it completely, that he didn't say who was on his little list for exclusion. And they say, that's obviously a really bad tactic. Well, that is a tactic which he'd used before. Other speeches, the best example actually is on the 22nd of Prairial, where there is a lot of people in this convention stand up on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th and say, do we really want this law which is going to intensify the terror and which seems to put us as deputies in the firing line? And one of the people who does that is Bourdon de Loise, who is a Dantoniste essentially, and Bourdon, and because of the way in which I won't repeat this passage, but basically Robespierre is at one stage effectively saying, anyone who opposes me is a knave, a scélérat. And Bourdon de Loise has the courage to stand up and say, are you calling me a scélérat? And Robespierre says, well, I'm not talking about personalities, but obviously it's if the cap fits, wear it, essentially. This is the tactic, in other words, which he has used before successfully. So it's a cognitive strategy on his part. It's not a sign that he suddenly lost it. The other thing which I think is very important as well is that it's part of a repetition, is the idea that he's deliberately leaving space for popular intervention. A lot of it, he's not a rabble-rouser in the sort of political, leading a crowd, mob rule type of thing. He's not a crowd manager. Last thing he is. You see that even more clearly on the 9th of Thermidor itself. What he does is he puts the arguments together, the arguments about popular sovereignty, and he knows that there is a sort of agenda there, and he knows that he's speaking over the heads of the Jacobins, over the heads even of the convention, to a wider population. At moments of crisis, he uses that sort of thing. That's why he withdraws, why he becomes silent, because he's leaving a space for political action. And I think that happens on the 8th and 9th of Thermidor, and I think that is, and the time before. That is a sign, I think, that he's acting here in a way which is very much part of his general strategy. In the past, popular action had indeed tended to come to the rescue of his own virtue, of this victim of his own virtue, and allow him to live and to fight and maybe display his wounds again, psychological or whatever, another day. But on the 9th of Thermidor, this didn't happen. Perhaps the biggest change on that day is not in Robespierre himself at all. As I say, for me, he's of a piece on the 8th of Thermidor, as he was at other times of crisis. Perhaps the biggest change was rather in the behaviour of those who were targeted as the victims of popular action. And for the first time in its history, back to 1789, the National Assembly equipped itself for military action on the streets of Paris. As we know, Barras and a dozen fellow conventionnels mobilized the sectional forces of the National Guard to defend the convention. This prefigured exactly what would happen in the subsequent journée of Germinal, Prairial and Vendémiaire. It had never happened before. It's another element of continuity, in other words, of the 8th of Thermidor, 8th and 9th of Thermidor, and the way in which that journée, as I've argued, shaped the legacy of revolution and violence in the years that followed. Thank you.